I have copies of four of my 5 books. John just bought one of them. I only bought single copies of these fatter books because they're pretty heavy, pretty clumsy to read. These are $20 a piece. My latest book, Yezhov versus Stalin, which is about the Great Terror, so-called, is $15. It's shorter, it's more readable, and I have multiple copies of that. So we can deal with that afterwards if anyone wants any, and I would ask you to take some of the flyers in any case. All right? So we'll take care of that at that time, right? Okay, so the title of this talk, let me just do it. The title of this talk is Reclaiming the History of the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution was the pivotal event of the 20th century. It and the other communist-led revolutions and the revolts against colonialism that it spurred and supported were the greatest movement for human liberation in history. The Stalin period, or period of Joseph Stalin's leadership of the Bolshevik Party in the Soviet state, is the heroic period of Soviet history. The greatest achievements of the Soviet Union and many of the great victories of the communist movement internationally took place during this period. Some of those triumphs are the collectivization of agriculture, putting an end to the 1,000-year cycle of severe and murderous famines suffered by Russia and Ukraine, the industrialization of this backward peasant country in a period of a decade to the point whereby the Soviet Union had the industrial means to defeat the Nazi Wehrmacht, the German army that had defeated every European army. The fight against racism within the multi-ethnic Soviet Union and the spread of the ideology and practice of combating racism throughout the world, for example, to the American Communist Party. The fight against sexism and the promotion of women into jobs and professions from which they had been previously debarred. The conquest of illiteracy and the spread of quality education, the provision to all Soviet citizens of low-cost housing, transportation, health care, guaranteed vacations, and old age pensions. Internationally, the Communist International, or Comintern, during the period of Stalin's leadership, spread the communist movement into virtually every country on earth, where the communist parties led the struggles against exploitation, racism, imperialism, sexism, and for workers' rights. The Comintern spearheaded revolutions against capitalism and for socialism in China, Vietnam, Korea, Albania, and Yugoslavia. The Comintern helped to organize the independence struggles of many colonial peoples from the murderous domination of the so-called Western democracies. These so-called democracies had never granted democracy to any of their colonial peoples, but held onto them as long as possible in order to exploit their labor and raw materials to the maximum. In some cases, the Soviet Union provided huge amounts of material and human aid, both to the battle for independence and to the struggle for economic development. We in the United States owe the few social welfare benefits we have, unemployment insurance, workmen's compensation, social security, the civil rights laws, and the great public works projects of the WPA, to the fear that American capitalists had for communist revolution because of the example of the Stalin-led Soviet Union. It is no exaggeration then to call the communist movement of the 20th century, especially during the Stalin period, the greatest movement for human liberation ever. These great actions and achievements are the reason why so many lies about Stalin and the Soviet history of the Stalin period are propagated. These lies serve to obscure and deny the triumphs of the communist movement of the 20th century. At the same time, they prevent us from understanding what really happened in the Soviet Union during this time. That means they prevent us from learning the lessons, positive and negative, that we must learn from this history. In this talk, I will review my own research on some of the lies about Stalin and the Stalin-era Soviet Union. I have discussed most of these issues in depth with reference to the relevant primary and secondary sources in my books and articles, and I'll briefly mention some of those. I will also talk briefly about the so-called Great Terror of 1937-38 in the Soviet Union, with reference to my latest book, Yezhov versus Stalin, The Truth About Mass Repressions and the So-Called Great Terror in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev lied. In terms of its practical impact on world history, Khrushchev's secret speech is the most influential speech of the 20th century. In it, Khrushchev painted Stalin as a bloodthirsty tyrant guilty of a reign of terror lasting more than 2 decades. As a direct result of this speech, about one-half of all members of communist parties in the non-communist bloc quit their parties within 2 years. After the 22nd Party Congress of 1961, where Khrushchev and his men attacked Stalin with even more venom, many Soviet historians elaborated Khrushchev's lies. These falsehoods were repeated by Cold War anti-communists like Robert Conquest. They also entered left discourse through the works of Trotskyists and anarchists, and of pro-Moscow communists, who of course had to accept Khrushchev's version. Khrushchev's lies are amplified during Mikhail Gorbachev's and Boris Yeltsin's time by professional Soviet, then Russian historians. Gorbachev orchestrated an avalanche of anti-communist falsehoods that provided the ideological smokescreen for the return to exploitative practices within the Soviet Union, and ultimately for the abandonment of Soviet socialist reforms and a return to predatory capitalism, which they have now. During 2005 and 2006, I researched and wrote the book, Khrushchev Lied. Right? This is it. In my book, I identify 61 accusations that Khrushchev made against either Stalin or, in a few cases, Beria. I then studied each one of them in the light of evidence available from former Soviet archives. To my own surprise, I found that 60 of the 61 accusations are provably, demonstrably false. The fact that Khrushchev could falsify everything and get away with it for over 50 years suggests that we should look carefully at other supposed crimes of Stalin and of the Soviet Union during his time. The murder of Sergei Kirov. Okay, that's my second book here. At about 4:30 p.m. on December 1st, 1934, Leonid Vasilievich Nikolaev, an unemployed party member, shot Sergei Mironovich Kirov, first secretary of the Bolshevik Party in Leningrad, in the back of the skull, killing him. Nikolaev then tried to shoot himself in the head, but missed and fainted. At first, Nikolaev seemed to have claimed that he had killed Kirov on his own. But within a week, he had admitted that he was a part of a conspiracy by a clandestine group of party members opposed to Stalin and favoring Grigory Zinoviev, Leningrad first secretary before Kirov. Interrogations of those whom Nikolaev had named, and then of the persons named by those men, led to a number of partial and a few fuller confessions. 3 weeks after the murder, 14 men were indicted for conspiracy to kill Kirov. They were tried on December 28th to 29th, 1934, convicted, and executed immediately. The larger significance of the Kirov murder unfolded gradually during the next 3 years. The threads that bound the Kirov conspirators to Zinoviev and Kamyanev led to the 3 Moscow trials show trials of 1936, 37, and 38, and to the trial of the military commanders known as the Tukhachevsky Affair of 1937. In his secret speech, Khrushchev cast doubt on the official version of the Kirov assassination. Khrushchev's men tried hard to find evidence that Stalin had been behind Kirov's murder. Unable to do so, they settled at length for a story that Nikolaev had acted on his own. However, the version that Stalin had caused Kirov to be killed continued to circulate, becoming widely believed both inside and outside the Soviet Union. Since 1990, the view officially accepted in Russia has been that Nikolaev acted alone, and that Stalin used Kirov's murder to frame former or putative rivals, forcing them to admit to crimes they had never committed, and executing them and ultimately many thousands more. In my 2013 book, The Murder of Sergei Kirov, History, Scholarship, and the Anti-Stalin Paradigm, I review all the evidence as objectively as possible, with appropriate skepticism, and without any preconceived conclusion in mind. The main conclusion of my study is that Nikolaev was not a lone gunman at all. The Soviet investigators and prosecution got it right in December 1934. A clandestine Zinovievite conspiratorial organization with ties to Trotskyists and rightists murdered Kirov. Timothy Snyder, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. In 2010, Timothy Snyder, a full professor of Eastern European history at Yale University, published Bloodlands. This book is the most successful attempt to date to equate Stalin with Hitler, the the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany, and communism with Nazism. It garnered rave reviews in dozens of newspapers and journals, received prizes for historiography, and has been translated into more than 25 languages. Snyder says little about the Nazis. His main target is Stalin, Soviet policy, and communists generally. He claims that the Soviets killed 6 to 9 million innocent civilians, while the Nazis were killing about 14 million. Snyder finds parallels between the Soviets and the Nazis at every turn. I spent 2.5 years methodically checking every single footnote, every reference to anything that could be construed as a crime by Stalin, the Soviet Union, or pro-Soviet communists in Snyder's book. Snyder's main sources are in Polish and Ukrainian, and hard-to-find books and articles. I found that every so-called crime Snyder alleges is false, a fabrication. Snyder often deliberately lies about what his sources say. More often, he cites anti-communist Polish and Ukrainian secondary sources that do the lying for him. Once again, not a single accusation is true. The significance of this wholesale falsification is important, I feel. For one thing, Snyder's book is now widely quoted as an authority. Snyder said it in Bloodlands, so it is established as a fact. But the broader significance of Snyder's wholesale lying and falsifying is this. Snyder had a team of very anti-communist Polish and Ukrainian nationalist researchers to help him. It is their work which he is basically retailing to an English-speaking audience. Snyder himself has spent many years researching Eastern Europe between the world wars. And yet, Snyder could not find a single genuine crime by the Soviet Union, Stalin, or even by pro-communist groups. Surely this team of dedicated anti-communists, armed with the support of their post-Soviet states, access to archives, and knowledge of all the Eastern European languages, would have discovered real crimes of Stalin or of the Soviet Union if any existed. My book on Snyder's Bloodlands, entitled Blood Lies, was published in September 2014, and John just bought my only copy here. Hold on. There it is. Hey. Great. The Lies of Leon Trotsky. Shortly after the Leon Trotsky Archive at Harvard's Houghton Library was opened in January 1980, Trotskyist historian Pierre Brouet discovered letters between Leon Sedov, that is Trotsky's son, and his father Trotsky that proved the existence of a bloc between Trotskyists and other opposition groups within the Soviet Union. At about the same time, American historian Arch Getty was discovering that Trotsky had secretly sent letters to at least Karl Radek, Grigory Sokolnikov, and Preobrazhensky. They had been Trotskyists before publicly recanting their views. Getty did not find the letters themselves, only the certified mail receipts for them. Getty realized this meant that the Trotsky archive had been purged. These letters had been removed. We now know that other materials were removed as well. These missing materials would have seemed incriminating, negatively impacting Trotsky's reputation. The letters that we know were removed proved at the very least that Trotsky lied during the 1930s by claiming he never maintained contact with oppositionists inside the Soviet Union, when in reality he was doing so, and by claiming he had never agreed to a secret bloc between his supporters and other oppositionist groups, when in fact he had done precisely that. In my book, Trotsky's Amalgams, 2015, that's that one, I devote 2 chapters to the Dewey Commission. This was a group set up supposedly to study the charges against Trotsky that had been made during the first and second Moscow trials of August 1936 and January 1937. Eventually, the Dewey Commission published 2 fat volumes, one of the hearings themselves entitled The Case of Leon Trotsky, and the second of the Commission's study of the evidence and their conclusions, titled Not Guilty. I discovered that neither of these works had been re-examined in the light of the evidence now available from the Trotsky archive at Harvard and from the former Soviet archives. Though there have been at least 10 full-scale biographies of Trotsky, published since the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, not a single one of them has undertaken to re-examine the Dewey Commission. In addition, I discovered a lot of other problems with the Dewey Commission, problems that should have caught the attention of any careful reader long ago. If the Dewey Commission members had known that Trotsky was lying to them, they could never have concluded, as they did, that Trotsky was not guilty. The Dewey Commission was and remains a world-class swindle. The evidence that Trotsky did conspire with the Germans and Japanese. A decade ago, I began to collect primary source evidence on the question of whether Leon Trotsky did indeed conspire with the German and Japanese military, as alleged in the second and third Moscow trials. In 2009, I published my article in the online journal Cultural Logic. There's a lot of evidence, and I spend even more space examining it. Now, the existence of this evidence must be accounted for in some way. Naturally, every individual piece of this evidence can be accounted for in multiple ways by several different hypotheses. But there are only two hypotheses that can account for all of this evidence. One, Trotsky did indeed conspire with the Germans and Japanese. Or two, all of this evidence was fabricated, faked by Stalin or by NKVD leaders Yagoda and Yezhov, or both. This second hypothesis also requires evidence that this fakery or forgery took place in different places and at different times within the Soviet Union, and in documents which were never published and never intended to be published. I will examine all of this and more in my second book on Trotsky in the 1930s, to be titled Trotsky's Conspiracies. It is scheduled for publication in the fall of this year, 2017. The Moscow trials. The newly available evidence confirms the following conclusion. The defendants at the Moscow trials of August 1936, January 1937, and March 1938 were guilty of at least those crimes to which they confessed. A bloc of Rights and Trotskyites did indeed exist. It planned to assassinate Stalin, Kaganovich, Molotov, and others in a coup d'etat, which they called a palace coup. The bloc did assassinate Kirov. Both Rights and Trotskyites were conspiring with the Germans and Japanese, as were the military conspirators. If the palace coup did not work, they hoped to come to power by showing loyalty to Germany or Japan in the event of an invasion. Trotsky, too, was directly conspiring with the Germans and Japanese, as were a number of his supporters. Was the trial testimony falsified? All anti-communist scholars assume that the trial testimony was falsified in some way which they do not specify. It is easy to find historians of Soviet history who make this assumption. But it is impossible to find one who proves it, or indeed has any evidence for it at all. There has never been any evidence that the testimony at the Moscow trials was falsified, the defendants forced to mouth confession composed or dictated by others. But, though there is no evidence that the testimony in these trials was falsified, there is a lot of evidence to the contrary, that the testimony was genuine. Most of this evidence might be explained as faked if there were any evidence that the confessions and the alleged plots had been scripted by the NKVD. But there is no evidence of any such conspiracy to fabricate the trials, while we do have evidence that they were not scripted. I devote the first 12 chapters of my book, Trotsky's Amalgams, 60% of the entire book, to carefully checking and verifying those aspects of the Moscow trial testimony that we can now check from other sources. The Yezhov or Great Terror of the summer of 1937 to the fall of 1938. Nikolai Yezhov, head of the NKVD, which stands for People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, had his own conspiracy against the Soviet government and party leadership. Yezhov had also been recruited by German intelligence. Like the Rights and Trotskyites, Yezhov and his top NKVD men were counting on an invasion by Germany, Japan, or other major capitalist countries. They tortured a great many innocent people into confessing to capital crimes so they could be shot. They executed a great many more on falsified grounds or on no grounds at all. Yezhov hoped that this mass murder of innocent people would turn large parts of the Soviet population against the government. That would create the basis for internal rebellions against the Soviet government when Germany or Japan attacked. As early as October 1937, Stalin and the party leadership began to suspect that some of the repression was being done illegally. When Lavrenti Beria was appointed as Yezhov's second in command, Yezhov and his men understood that Stalin and the party leadership no longer trusted them. They made one last plot to assassinate Stalin at the November 7, 1938 celebration of the 21st anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. But Yezhov's men were arrested in time. Yezhov was persuaded to resign. An intensive investigation was begun, and a huge number of NKVD abuses were uncovered. A great many cases of those tried or punished under Yezhov were reviewed. Over 100,000 people were released from prisons and camps during Beria's first year. How could this happen? From the evidence now available, it appears that there were two kinds of conspiracies against Stalin and the Soviet leadership. The first were the oppositionists, Zinoviev, Trotsky, the rightists like Bukharin, and the military conspirators like Marshal Tukhachevsky. The second group was comprised of party officials who bitterly opposed the Stalin Constitution of 1936. They were especially hostile to 2 points in it: contested elections for the Soviets, the legislative branch of government, and putting political power into the hands of the Soviets rather than into the hands of party officials, or rather taking it out of the hands of party officials and giving it to the Soviets. Stalin, it appears, was trying to carry out one of the basic demands of the revolution of 1917, all power to the Soviets. This threatened the dominance of party leaders over all areas of economic and political life. Under Beria, the number of executions in 1939 and 1940 dropped to less than 1% of the number under Yezhov in 1937 and 38. And many of those executed were NKVD men, including Yezhov himself, who were found to be guilty of massive unjustified repression and executions of innocent people. Anti-communist scholars hide the truth. All anti-communist and Trotskyist researchers falsely claim that there were no conspiracies. According to them, all the Moscow trial defendants, all the military defendants, and all those tried in sentences for espionage, conspiracy, sabotage, and other crimes were innocent victims. Some claim that Stalin had planned to kill all these people because they might constitute a fifth column, a front of disloyal people, if the Soviet Union were attacked. Other anti-communists prefer the explanation that Stalin just tried to terrorize the population into obedience. This is an ideological anti-communist stance masquerading as a historical conclusion. It is not based upon the historical evidence and is inconsistent with that evidence. Anti-communist historians ignore the primary source evidence available. They even ignore evidence in collections of documents that they themselves cite in their own works. Why do they do this? Why do they continue to promote the false notions that no conspiracies existed and that Stalin, not Yezhov, decided to execute hundreds of thousands of innocent people? The only possible explanation is that they do this for ideological reasons alone. The truth, as established by an examination of the primary source evidence, would make Stalin and the Bolsheviks look good to many people. Objectivity and evidence. I agree with historian Jeffrey Roberts, well-known historian of the Soviet Union, when he says, quote, "In the last 15 years or so, an enormous amount of new material on Stalin has become available from Russian archives. I should make it clear that, as a historian, I have a strong orientation to telling the truth about the past, no matter how uncomfortable or unpalatable the conclusions may be. I don't think there is a dilemma. You just tell the truth as you see it. The conclusions I have reached about the Yezhovshchina, or Great Terror, will be unacceptable to ideologically motivated people. I have not reached these conclusions out of any desire to apologize for the policies of Stalin or the Soviet government. I believe these to be the only objective conclusions possible based upon the available evidence." The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. At a conference some years back, a liberal anti-communist threw the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact often called by anti-communists the Hitler-Stalin Pact, in my face. How could I defend it? He virtually shouted at me. I realized that I did not know nearly as much about it as I should. So I spent the summer of 2009 researching it. The result is a monograph-sized article entitled, quote, "Did the Soviet Union invade Poland in September 1939? The answer, no, it did not." You can read it with 17 web pages of evidence and documentation on my homepage. I learned a lot. For one thing, I learned that the pact was not an alliance, although it is often called an alliance between the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany. I learned that the Soviet Union did not invade Poland in September 1939. I'll try to put that in a provocative way. Maybe somebody will respond. And that all the Allies agreed at the time that it did not. I learned that the Soviet Union was the only country that acted properly in the pre-war period. This is the only conclusion I could honestly reach. I discuss this question at even more length in my recent book, Blood Lies. The Katyn Massacre. In April 1943, Nazi German authorities claimed that they had discovered thousands of bodies of Polish officers shot by Soviet officials in 1940 near the Katyn forest near Smolensk in western Russia. The Nazi propaganda machine organized a huge campaign around this alleged discovery. After the Soviet victory at Stalingrad in February 1943, it was obvious to everyone that, unless something happened to split the Allies, Germany would inevitably lose the war. The Nazis' obvious aim was to drive a wedge between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. The Soviet government, headed by Joseph Stalin, vigorously denied the German charge. When the Polish government in exile in London, always ferociously anti-communist and anti-Russian, collaborated with the Nazi propaganda effort, the Soviet government broke diplomatic relations with it. During the Cold War, the Western capitalist countries supported the Nazi version, now promoted by the anti-communist Poles. The Soviet Union and its allies continued to blame the Germans until, in 1989 to 1992, Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin stated that the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin had indeed shot the Poles. At the beginning of 2013, I learned about archaeological findings at a German mass murder site in Ukraine. Because I had been following the dispute over the Katyn massacre for many years, I recognized the implications of these findings. They provide material evidence that the Soviet Union could not have shot the Polish prisoners of war in 1940. The discoveries in the mass graves at Volodymyr Volynski, Ukraine, constitute a lethal blow to the official version of the Katyn massacre. This is something that should interest us all. Katyn has been the most famous crime alleged against Stalin and the Soviet government. It has hitherto also been the crime most firmly grounded in documentary evidence. I've recently completed researching and writing a book-length study of the Katyn massacre. That's not quite true. I've completed 5 drafts, but I need to write at least 1 or 2 more drafts. It will be published in March or April of next year, in other words, in about a year. In this book, I study all the primary source evidence and all the important secondary sources. On the evidence, there is no question that the Germans, not the Soviets, were guilty. Katyn has been the best documented crime of Stalinism, and it's a lie. The hoax of the Holodomor. During the Civil War of 1918 to 1921, anti-communist Ukrainian nationalists were used by the Germans as a force to fight the Bolsheviks. During the 1930s, they were trained by German fascists. During World War II, Ukrainian nationalist forces fought alongside the German army and swore allegiance to Adolf Hitler. They engaged in mass murders of Jews and other Soviet citizens, and in a true genocide against Polish civilians in German-occupied Ukraine in 1943 to 44. After the war, many fled to Western Europe, the USA, and especially to Canada. In the USA, they were supported for decades by the CIA. They developed 2 false histories. One was that the Ukrainian nationalist forces were freedom fighters who had fought against both Hitler and Stalin. The second was that Stalin, the communist, had deliberately caused the 1932 to 1933 famine in the Ukrainian SSR as an attempt to wipe out Ukrainian nationalist sentiment among the peasantry. This they called the Holodomor, a word they coined, meaning death by starvation, invented to sound like Holocaust. A more liberal anti-communist version of the famine is that it was caused by the collectivization of agriculture. There has never been any evidence at all to support these falsehoods, and there still isn't. But they are embraced by Ukrainian nationalists in order to try to justify their Nazi collaboration and massacres of civilians. The Holodomor hoax is spread by Trotskyists as well, since two of Trotsky's last essays were in support of Ukrainian nationalism. When Trotsky wrote, the only Ukrainian nationalists were fascists. Trotsky had to know that. Early this month, I published a short article about this in Counterpunch, the online journal, where you can read it. I also devote the first 2 chapters of my book, Blood Lies, to exposing the phony Holodomor and Timothy Snyder's dishonest attempts to find evidence to support this Nazi lie. And to be honest, you'll see it, I support it thanks to Professor Mark Tauger's research, right? Not my own, but his. So attack him, not me. Why all the lies? Here's the situation. Khrushchev lied. All the experts lie about the murder of Sergei Kirov. Leon Trotsky lied. Timothy Snyder lied, and so do all his expert colleagues in Eastern Europe who have the financial support of their right-wing anti-communist governments and access to archives. The mainstream version of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which the anti-communists call the Hitler-Stalin Pact, is false. The so-called definitive studies of the Katyn massacre are fraudulent. The Holodomor is a Nazi-inspired lie. All the scholars who run in the so-called Great Terror ignore the evidence, and therefore they're lying too. That's a lot of lying, right? Let's think about that. Why would all these people lie about Stalin and the Stalin-era Soviet Union if they knew of any real, demonstrable, provable crimes of what they call Stalinism? The only possible conclusion is they can't find a single real, provable crime that Stalin and the Soviets committed. This is the best evidence we will probably ever have that there were no such crimes. Conclusion. I began this talk by pointing out that the Bolshevik Revolution was the inception of the greatest movement for human liberation in world history. No wonder then that the capitalists and imperialists and their dishonest scholars revile, slander, and lie about it. In this talk, I have touched on a few of the more important events of Soviet history of the 1930s. In conclusion, I would like to say something about objectivity and the attempt to discover the truth. Almost all the books and articles published today about Soviet history of the Stalin period are framed and therefore controlled by what I call the anti-Stalin paradigm. In Western academic discussion, it is obligatory, required, that a researcher come to conclusions that confirm the anti-communist portrayal of Stalin as a vicious, evil killer and dictator, and the Soviet Union as a site of mass murder and cruelty. If you are unwilling to put your research within this biased framework, you simply can't have an academic career. I have been told by 2 fine researchers in Soviet history, researchers who are not leftists but who strive to be objective, that no book that is not hostile to Stalin can be published by an academic publisher. That is certainly true in the West, and I believe it to be true in Russia too. A lot of people on the right do not want the truth about the history of the communist movement in the Soviet Union during the Stalin years to come to light. They want to continue to demonize it, to compare it to Hitler and fascism, and to lie about it. And that's what they do. Not only passively through their point of view or bias, but actively by deliberately falsifying the evidence, sources, and history. Marx and Engels wrote that the proletariat has nothing to lose but its chains. By that, I assume they meant that we have no sacred cows, nothing we refuse to subject to critical scrutiny. We want to cast aside all illusions and falsehoods. Only the truth shall make us free if we are against all exploitation of man by man. Marx's favorite slogan was De omnibus dubitandum, which means question everything, and your preconceived ideas and biases above all others. If you want to learn the truth, that's what you must do. And Marx himself would be the last person to make an exception of his own writings, okay? This is what I try hard to do. None of the demonizers of Stalin and the Soviet Union, the anti-communist experts on the history of the communist movement, make any attempt to be objective. They don't discover the truth then because they don't want to do so. They want to write propaganda with footnotes, and that's what their works are. In my view, the importance of all this new evidence and research lies mainly in proving the utter dishonesty of the mainstream accounts of Soviet history. Accounts that pass for the truth, not only among Cold War anti-communists, not only among Trotskyists, but also the mainstream view among Marxists and communists. For example, Louis Proyect's recent essays in Counterpunch, right? Which is, I guess, not the most left-wing popular journal that exists in the United States. We Marxists ought to be relieved. All around the world, the horror stories about Stalin and the Stalin period are employed to discredit Marxism, socialism, and communism. Now we can see these horror stories are lies. The communist movement in the Soviet Union did not lead to communism. Instead, it led back to capitalism. Obviously, the Bolsheviks made serious errors. But these are the errors not of criminals and murderers, but of pioneers. The Bolsheviks are blazing an unmarked trail, going where no man had gone before. Remember Star Trek? In this sense, then, they were not even errors, but part of the process of learning how to build communism. But we who come after them must carefully study what they did. We will never discover what those errors were, or what the Bolsheviks did that was right, correct, admirable, worthy of imitation, unless we know what really happened. A new and better communist movement can only be rebuilt upon the sound foundation of historical truth, not upon the sand of anti-communist lies. I am glad to be playing a small part in the effort to uncover this true history. Thank you.